Here we are, it's the finale of the longest ever series at Althea. It's been a long journey that we've been on, each week exploring a different value that has deep possibility potential for us, not only as individuals, but to transform our world, right? It's been a long journey. It's been, I believe, a 15-week journey that we've been on. I know that there are some of you out there who have had relationships shorter than that. Maybe those of you who have moved to another state or even another country, figured out you didn't like it, came back, and all that happened in a shorter time span than this series, right? So I figured we have to end sometime. And I thought, let's end with a value, maybe even a meta value that encapsulates everything that we've been talking about. Because I think if I look back through all these different values, that in one way or another, they're exploring how we show up as human beings in such a way that honors our own humanity, that honors the connective humanity of one another, and even looks at reality itself, and it has deep gratitude for this gift of being a human being, right? But you might be asking, how is humanity of value? Isn't it like more of a species? Like, how could I be more or less human than I already am, right? But it is something that we ask all the time. We ask if something is humane or not. We are investigating always whether or not a system or a behavior is dehumanizing or not. And so this idea of whether or not we are actually acting and behaving as humans, whether or not we have or don't have humanity, though it might seem abstract, it's also very real in how it shows up in our lives, in our world. We do struggle with losing and finding our humanity, don't we? And it's true that we might be the only species that has this struggle. You know, I don't know if a tree goes to another tree and is like, you're not treeing very well today, you know, and certainly I don't know what dogs are saying to one another when they're smelling each other's butts, but they might, I don't know if they're saying, you know, like, that was very uncanine behavior of you. I will say that my dog does sometimes act like a human, and it's very strange, but sometimes she'll sit up like a human, and if it means that she is going to get more pets. So I'll show you this little clip of her. If I can get, oh, there you go. It's not the most comfortable position for her, but if it means she can be in the angle to receive more pets, she will sit up like a human being. We're worried for her orthopedic spinal health, but you don't let her do this too often. So it's true that, you know, a dog might act like a human, but we as human beings, we are constantly asking this question, what is humane? And in many ways, I think it's been the arc of the human journey on some level that we've been, you know, over millennia, we've been raising the bar in certain areas. Things that 1,000 years ago were considered normal and acceptable, now we treat as inhumane. Things that even happened 100 years ago that we would have accepted as normal, we now consider to be dehumanizing. But here we are today at the convergence of many different crises, many of which are based around questions of human worth, right? What is a human being worth? What is the value of each human being? What are the rights of each human being? And friends, this goes so far beyond being more American, right? Or being more, insert your political affiliation, right? In many ways, those identities are arbitrary when held up against the grand scheme of our true humanity. Conservationist and activist Tempest Williams reminds us that in times of crises, we must decide again and again whether to become more or less human. So how do we embody this sacred value of humanity? How is it that we become more human? Perhaps we should start by asking ourselves, what is it when we become less human? What does that look like? Perhaps when we lose our ability to feel the pain, the experience, the struggle of someone who is different from us. Perhaps when we are no longer able to relate to the diverse experiences of being human, we're not able to connect to our brothers and sisters. Maybe then we are starting to lose our humanity. Maybe when we've forgotten the fundamental truth that we are all so much more similar than we are different. And it comes down to a simple word, one that's shown up time and time again throughout this series: empathy. Author J.M. Coetzee reminds us that empathy, the capacity for empathy, is the distinguishing mark of humanity. It's really this question: can you look at another human being, perhaps in very different circumstances than you, perhaps very different upbringing, different worldview, and can you, as much as possible, feel into their experience? There's a difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is feeling bad for someone's experience, feeling bad for someone's suffering. Empathy is the attempt to feel into it, to feel what it might feel like, right? To put ourselves in someone else's shoes. Yet what's fascinating to me is that in the current cultural climate, there is this new wave of thought in which empathy has started to become treated as a problem, as an issue. I rarely quote people when I'm disagreeing with them, but I'm going to change that today. I'm going to share a quote that I do not agree with. It's from a pretty well-known car salesman. Elon Musk recently said, "The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy." Kathleen, can we set up a debate between you and Elon? Recently, conservative Christian author Ali Beth Stuckey came out with a book called Toxic Empathy: How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion. Right? Just putting those two words together is pretty shocking to me. Toxic empathy. And so really what we see is there's this subtle and maybe not so subtle attack on empathy going on in our culture. What I want to do, though, is I want to be generous with these people for a second, right? Because we're talking about there is no them, there's only us. So let's try to, instead of fighting this with resistance, with anger, let's try to bring empathy into this attack on empathy. Oh, really? And if we were to do so, right, if we were to treat things that way, then how would we look at ourselves? How would we be honest and look at ourselves and say that we all in some way, shape, or form behave in ways that cut ourselves off from our own capacity for empathy, our own capacity to connect with our humanity? And I think that if we were all to be really honest with ourselves, really introspective with ourselves, what we might find going deep into our souls is that if we were to open ourselves up to the experience of all of humanity, what would be unlocked within us is a deep well of grief, a deep well of pain. That if we were truly to open ourselves up to the experience of all humankind, it would be unbearable. We would question whether we could truly hold the weight of the unbearableness of it. And yet we are connected to all humankind. It's been said that all human beings are within 6 degrees of separation from you. It's also been said that all celebrities are within 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon. You probably know this. But genetically speaking, you are within 50 to 80 degrees of separation within all human beings, in that they are all genetically related to you, within 50 to 80 degrees of separation. So, I mean, you might recognize your first cousin or your second, maybe stop there. But if you were willing to recognize your 50th cousin, that would include all humanity. It would. And so if we follow that train of thought for a second and we treat all humans as family, it can be impossible to bear the reality that there are members of your family right now oppressed, starving, suffering in war zones. But to feel on this level, I believe, functions much like a valve that can open or close. And what I mean by that is we can't really pick and choose whether or not we're going to feel this thing but not feel this other thing, right? We can't increase our sensitivity towards life, towards love in one way and not in another, right? We can only open or close. We can either numb ourselves to the reality of the world, or we can allow ourselves to feel the grief. Our heart can break, or it can calcify. But we can't really say, oh, I feel for what's going on here in this country, here in America, but I don't really feel for what's going on in Gaza, right? We can't truly do that. If we do that on some level, we've lost something within ourselves. And so this idea of toxic empathy, what the claim is, right? What people who are, using this phrase, what they're trying to say is that if you were to actually empathize with another person whose story is different from yours, you may be so moved by what you're experiencing that you would become ungrounded in your own values and what you believe. But friends, I would rather, 100% of the time, I would rather run the risk of what some people might call toxic empathy than devolve into numbness, into disconnection, into picking and choosing what I'm willing to feel and what I'm willing not to. As great American author Toni Morrison once said, no more apologies for a bleeding heart when the opposite is no heart at all. Danger of losing our humanity must be met with more humanity. So let's break down for a second. Why would we ever move in the direction of losing our humanity? Why would we make choices in that way? Well, it comes down to something, I believe, that really not only is very clear and obvious in our culture today, but has been with us since the beginning, since humans began to gather. And really, it's something we might call in-group, out-group dynamics. That for there to be an in somewhere, for you to belong to a tribe or a group, there on some level implies an out, that there are people who are not a part of that group. And throughout history, this has led to violence, oppression, systems of dehumanization. But we even engage in it day to day without even realizing it, right? That we probably in the last year and a half or so may have at times, identified politically in a certain way where there was your group and there was them over there, right? There's the people that believe like you and the people that don't, and there are clear dividing lines. If you were to go further back, maybe some of you, if you were like me, came up in a religious upbringing that said there are people that are part of our group and our tribe and people who are not. And what this does, we get this illusion of safety, right? Because it's like this is our tribe, this is our people, we're safe together, and we're kind of standing against something else. But it really only provides an illusion, right? And so whether it's subtle or very overt, as we have sometimes seen in our culture today, this in-group, out-group thing, what it really does is it invites us to treat other people as less than human, right? That those who are on the in, this is the humanity that I belong to, and those who are not a part of my group are less than human. There was a book that came out in 2020 called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. It was adapted into a movie a few years later called Origin. If you're these days, if you're not so much reading and you're more into movies, you can just watch the movie. Beautiful film. But a really powerful journey that this author went on, because what she did was she wanted to understand what has broken down in our society that has caused so much of a divide racially, politically. And what she began to find is that beneath the dynamics that we often look to, things like race, she found that actually the reality is that our divisions go further than that, much, much deeper. She looked at the Holocaust, and what she found is that really you have this idea of ethnic difference, this concept that was actually created in order to facilitate the dehumanizing of one group. And what she actually found was that the very people who created this dynamic, right? The politicians, the leaders in Nazi Germany who created this divide, they actually were borrowing from the playbook of American slavery, where again, there was created this dynamic. There was this manufactured idea of racial difference. And so she followed this thread all the way back to the caste system in India, which goes back thousands of years. And what she found is that there you have a system where people who are all ethnically very similar or identical are separated into hierarchical groups where those at the bottom are treated as less than human. So it went beyond race. And it was really that we as human beings have this propensity to create social strata, that these people are worth more than these people. But here's what she said about the danger of this. She says, dehumanization distances not only the out-group from the in-group, but those in the in-group from their own humanity. It makes slaves to groupthink of everyone in the hierarchy. That it's like a poison. If we participate in this at any level, then on some level we are compromising our own humanity, right? If there is an out-group at all, then really the in-group is compromised. The in-group is sick, it's unwell, that we can't have that. We can't have an out-group. So when you dehumanize another, and I know it doesn't always feel so clear and so obvious, but when we engage in acts that dehumanize another, we are dehumanizing ourselves. And of course, it's easier to do as groups, right? It's easier to say that those people over there are different. It's much harder to look someone in the eye, but it still happens, unfortunately, far too often. And so this us and them, where we stratify the human experience, where we say that these human beings are worth more than these, it really becomes a question of value. It's something that we've been talking about since the beginning of this series. That our values are actually about what we value. And the question I want to ask you today is, are you going to value those in your group, or are you going to value all of humanity, all of life? So what if the language that we so often use, you and me, us and them, what if we expanded that out? To start to create one big we, one giant us. Now this can be very difficult, right? Because included in that we are the people that we don't like. And I know that you all are so enlightened that that's not the case for any of us, right? That I know that you here today, there's no one that you don't like. So if you just want to use your imagination, maybe expand it out to people in the public eye, right? Like culture, politicians, right? And again, I know you're so enlightened that there's no one in politics that you don't like either. But just if it were to be the case, right? Could you include all humanity in your we? Right? Really, can we include all living beings? But let's just get humanity today, okay? We sang that song, right? When I look at the face of my enemy, I see my brother, my sister, my father or mother. That there would be no one that I place outside of my own humanity. Otherwise, my own humanity is lost. And yet it might be something we never say, we never verbalize, but it shows up in our actions, or it shows up in our hearts and minds. May we not forget that we can only honor our own humanity if we honor the humanity of all others. And not forgetting that the most human thing to do is to see ourselves in others. And this is something where our minds are only going to take us so far in this pursuit, right? We need to lean into and rely on our hearts. As Christian mystic Henry Nouwen once said, what makes us human is not our mind, but our heart, not our ability to think, but our ability to love. Our minds, they're great gifts, right? They have given us many things. In many ways, they distinguish us, and they have allowed for, technology, whatever it is, but our minds are not what we're really talking about today, because our capacity to think is also what gets us into things like coming up with ideas like toxic empathy, right? That's where what our minds do. But our capacity to care, our capacity to open our hearts, this is what's going to be key in this quest for humanity. And I want to explore this a little further, draw upon a parable of Jesus. That just as Kathleen shared, Jesus said, love thy neighbor as thyself. And this actually comes from a conversation that Jesus is having with a group of people. And so there is a religious scholar in this conversation that says, well, what do you mean by neighbor, right? Like, what exactly does that mean? And so Jesus, as he often did, responded to a question, not with a straight answer, but with a story. And I think that this story has a lot of power and potency for what we're talking about today. So I want to just read it briefly and then break it down. It comes from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. You might know this one. It's called the parable of the Good Samaritan. He says, there was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road, but when he saw him, he angled across to the other side. Then a Levite religious man showed up. He also avoided the injured man. Finally, a Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him onto his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him comfortable. In the morning, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take good care of him. If it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back." Now, Jesus, out of this story, responds to the religious scholar. He says, "What do you think? Which of the 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers?" "The one who treated him kindly," the religion scholar responded. And Jesus says, "Go and do the same." So just a little context here. The Jewish people, not unlike the caste system in India, had a social hierarchy very set in stone, where at the top of the social hierarchy would have been the religious elite, people like this priest or this Levite religious man. And at the bottom would have been the people that are treated as them, right? The us and them. At the bottom would have been people who maybe had different beliefs or were different culturally. And so the Samaritans would have been at the bottom because Samaritans were a group who centuries before had sort of branched out of the Israelite people with some slight religious differences, some slight ethnic differences, and yet over time had become the undesirables of society. But what Jesus does in this story, in answering what makes my neighbor, right? What is the purpose? What is our humanity, right? What is that? How does that function? Jesus, he says it's not about one's status, one's place on this hierarchy. It's not about what culture you were born into. All that matters is your capacity to care, your ability to be human. And this for me resonates of what I think of as a modern day Samaritan story happening in our culture very recently, that many of you know about the horribly tragic flooding that happened in Texas last month. And in response to this event, Mexico sent 13 firefighters as support for the relief efforts. Now, if you haven't been paying attention, our relationships with our neighbors to the north and to the south have been quite tense lately. And yet through all this, there was a reach of care, a reach of humanity from our neighbors. Ismail Adalbo, one of the participants, one of the firefighters, he says this: when it comes to firefighters, there's no borders. There's nothing that'll avoid us from helping another firefighter, another family. It doesn't matter where we're at in the world. That's the whole point of our discipline and what we do. May we expand that into our lives. May we all behave like firefighters, right? I mean, I know you probably don't have like a pole that you can go down in your home, but other than that, you can do this. This is a modern day Samaritan story. And yet, for some of you, it might be interesting for us to bring in a parable, a story of Jesus into this conversation, because, for many of you, immediately your mind goes, okay, Jesus is this religious, this spiritual figure. And for many of us, when we think about religion or spirituality, we think about this pull towards transcending our humanity, getting out of our humanity. That many of us grew up in a religious system where we felt like we were being guided out of our humanity, right? And yet, in this story, it's clear Jesus is inviting us further into our humanity, right? But it's something that we tend to do. We tend to look towards spirituality and sometimes want to escape our humanity. Certainly, we have the technology that is starting to form in our society today that is allowing us to, in many ways, escape our humanity, that there's a growing capacity and a movement that we have given ourselves through technology to change and escape and rewire our humanity, right? We all carry around these supercomputers in our pockets that we are subtly merging with, right? And we have no idea yet how our cell phones are changing our relationship to our own humanity, right? There's technology, we're talking and thinking about how we might reverse aging, or there's AI and questions of how that's going to change our relationship to humanity. Or you have some people who we previously mentioned who are trying to go to Mars, right? And leave this planet. And look, who knows? I have no idea what the future holds, and I don't know what's going to be beneficial or not. But one thing I am pretty clear on is that we haven't yet really figured out how to do humanity yet, right? We're trying to escape it. We're trying to evolve past it. We haven't even done this one, right? We're skipping ahead. We're trying to go to Mars. We haven't really figured out how to live well on Earth and take care of our planet. Right? We haven't figured out how to live in a sense of equality, making sure everyone is taken care of, everyone is treated well. If we can do that, maybe we can have a conversation about what's next, right? So there's the technology piece, right? But then I also, maybe you share this, I grew up in a spiritual context, a religious context, which in many ways taught me that this life was the preamble to something better to come. And in many ways that taught me that the goal of this life is to escape it. That there's something called rapture theology, rapture ideology, which essentially says that there's something better on its way that's coming to whisk you away, and the goal is to be on the right boat, right? To be in the right team. We had a conversation with former pastor Ryan Meeks a couple of weeks ago, and during this, he had this really beautiful thought on the reality that while we don't know what anything after this life may hold, we do know the value of this life. And so I want to share again just what he said. In regards to our life here, he says, this ain't nothing, but it might be everything. And the paradox of that is, if I live like it's everything, then I might actually live a life that's so beautiful, it might be worth continuing for eternity. We don't know what is beyond this life. But if we treated this life as if it was all we had, maybe it would be a life worth living forever. It's a beautiful thought. We don't know what the future holds, right? As we live and beyond. But what we do know is that we are human beings now. And in that, may we recognize there is a preciousness to this life, right? That this life is a gift. And this life is incredibly fragile, right? Not only each human life, but humanity as a whole, we are all more fragile than we know. And our shared bond, our common humanity is also fragile. So may we preserve, protect, love, and cherish it. As we close this gargantuan series today, I just want to ask you again, what are the values, the guiding lights for you, the North Stars for you that lead you to greater love, greater care, greater compassion, right? Hopefully we don't lean on the government or religion or Facebook to define those values for us, right? But really we just ask ourselves, what are the values that keep us human, right? Maybe we find them by looking deep into our own humanity. There were a great deal of people who participated, offering their own wisdom and perspective throughout this series. So I just want to share gratitude for some of the guests we have. As we close, I just want to kind of do a retrospective of all of the values that we've explored along the way, so that, it might be something that you can hold on to, remember something that was meaningful to you along this journey, right? So as we close this series, may we have the grit to stay in the race. May we be unafraid to set boundaries that preserve our well-being. May we remember that to be enthusiastic literally means to be filled with the divine. May we remember that we can be flexible or we can be miserable. May we be optimistic, not because it's the easy, obvious choice, but because it's always your choice to make. May we value inclusion, even when that means including those who don't yet know how to include. May we see that holistic health unites mind, body, and soul. May we understand that compassion holds space for the complexity of every human being. May we always hold in our hearts that life is a gift and love is the point. May we realize how courageous and necessary vulnerability is. May we remember that our greatest gift to the world, and perhaps the greatest gift we could ever give one another, is presence. May we recognize that forgiveness is not simply about others, but it's more about freeing yourself. May we allow humility to keep us close to the earth. And may we never forget that it is our capacity for love, for care, and for empathy that truly makes us human.